You might think this film was shot from an F-111 or some other specialist low-level attack aircraft. In fact, the view actually comes from an aircraft that was conceived and built as a heavy bomber. With over 30 years of flying and still in frontline service, this is Boeing's remarkable B-52 Stratofortress. Aging now, these later models of the Boeing B-52 range are still in operation with the Strategic Air Command and often fly missions carrying state-of-the-art cruise missiles. But this superb design is now approaching the end of its more than 30 years of service in a low-level bomber role. And this is something of a paradox, as the B-52 Stratofortress, as its name implies, was originally designed and built to fly at a great height as a long-range intercontinental strategic bomber. When it went into service in 1955, the B-52 was the pinnacle of jet bomber design. And yet, it actually owes much of its origin to a decision made by the Defense Department 10 years earlier, when the nation was at war. Throughout much of World War II, America was committed to the development of proven technology, because this would enable the rapid development of production lines to turn out the tools of war with the urgency needed. Piston engines were greatly improved, and it was still that type of power plant that would drive every American aircraft to see service in World War II. Even the massive Boeing B-29, with more speed, range and payload than any other bomber, and upon which so much importance was to be placed, still depended upon piston engine technology. Early in the war, it came as a major shock for the US to learn that Germany and Britain had developed gas turbine jet engines, which would soon be able to propel fighters at speeds that would far outstrip even the fabled Superfortress. In 1944, the American Air Force issued a requirement for an all-jet bomber with such speed that it could elude jet fighters, and contracts were issued for not less than 5 different designs to be built. But it was to be another technology, that of nuclear fission, which was actually to bring the war to a quick and dramatic end. Although it did involve a B-29, just one aircraft dropped one bomb, and in seconds, the city of Hiroshima ceased to exist. If one aircraft could carry such a devastating payload, then large fleets of bombers would no longer be needed to win another war. But the dreadful cost in lives that America had paid to obtain B-29 bases in the Pacific had now changed the parameters for the next generation of bombers. During the early post-war period, strategy concentrated on the ability to deliver the atomic bomb over very long distances, and the Air Force put its emphasis on long-range intercontinental aircraft, a role that the Convair B-36 Peacemaker adequately filled for some time. The behemoth B-36 was really a Second World War design that arrived late, and it required no less than 6 massive piston engines to propel it at what were average speeds. However, jet engines were later fitted in pods under the wing to supplement its power. By 1947, the jet bomber project was starting to come to fruition, and it was in that year that each of the 5 submissions were tested, although by now they would be classed as medium bombers. The B-45 was the first of the jets from the 1944 requirement, and it was the second most successful. This simple but effective 4-engine design was actually adopted by the Air Force and went into service in limited numbers, although mainly in the reconnaissance role. Consolidated offered the B-46 as another 4-jet engined bomber. Its clean lines made it one of the most elegant aircraft of the time, and its performance as an early jet was quite acceptable. However, Consolidated were heavily committed to B-36 production, and the medium bomber project was not given a high priority. The B-48, which was produced by Martin, was something of a cumbersome design and employed 6 jet engines in mid-wing clusters. About the most impressive technology it offered was its bicycle undercarriage, placed on the centerline of the aircraft and supported by 2 outrigger wheels on each wing. This project did not tempt the Air Force, and as with the 46, the prototype was scrapped. Northrop, in an attempt to compete in the jet bomber program, took its previously piston-engined flying wing and equipped it with 8 turbojets. The wing was a brilliant design, offering excellent efficiency, and was years ahead of its time, but it never seemed to attract government approval. The technological grasp that Northrop had on flying wings was to pay a dividend 40 years later in the form of the stealth bomber program. However, in 1947, it was considered to be just too revolutionary. Without doubt, the most impressive design to be offered to the Air Force came from Boeing. Their B-47 Stratojet design benefited from the manufacturer's analyses of German data on swept wing technology. To obtain the maximum efficiency these wings could provide, they were made extremely thin and very flexible. Therefore, its 6 engines had to be suspended on pylons and were spread across each wing. This approach made servicing the engines easier and also had aerodynamic benefits for the aircraft at speed. Because the wing was so thin, Boeing used the same fuselage-mounted bicycle undercarriage as Martin's B-48. The B-47 was accepted by the Air Force, and literally hundreds were produced during the early 50s. It was, by any standard, a very successful design, a classic case of having the right design at the right time. But, just as importantly, it was an ideal test bed for Boeing to gain experience on the production of efficient swept-wing jet bombers. One of the problems of early jet engines was the relatively long time they took to reach full power, especially at takeoff. To offset this, Boeing adopted several versions of detachable rocket boosters for what became known as jet-assisted takeoffs, or JATO. Following on from its earlier piston-engine bombers, the success of the Stratojet project was to hold Boeing in good stead with the Air Force in years to come. For whilst the medium bomber role was catered for, it was obvious that long-range heavy bombers provided by the B-36 program would not meet the demands of the late 50s. In an attempt to keep the Peacemaker project alive, Convair produced an all-jet swept-wing version given the model number XB60. But a revamping of an aircraft that had been originally designed in the Second World War did not impress the Air Force. As far back as 1946, Boeing had been commissioned to develop a replacement for the Peacemaker, and the company explored hundreds of different concepts, ranging from ultra-large piston-engined aircraft to those using proposed compound supercharged power plants, and others with jet engines driving propellers. But nothing seemed to provide the sort of increase in performance over the B-36 that the Air Force was looking for. When the efficiency of the B-47's full-swept wing became apparent, Boeing proposed another all-jet concept, based loosely along a similar design to its medium bomber, but larger, much larger. This idea was refined on model 46467 and was ultimately accepted by the Air Force as the B-52. An order for 2 prototypes, the X and Y models, was placed in October 1948. But due to minor problems with the X model, it was the Y B-52 that was ready first. This is the YB, undergoing tests at Edwards Air Force Base. Its overall shape and fighter-like canopy was similar to the B-47, but its size and performance was much greater. The 52 also had many updated features, like the all-steerable undercarriage, which adjusted to face forward on landing even when the aircraft was crabbing to one side. This feature was top secret for several years. Apart from the cockpit layout, which was changed to a conventional side-by-side airliner arrangement, there was very little external difference between the prototypes and the B-52s that were to go into production in the form of the Air Force's A model, now named Stratofortress. Of the first A models, only 3 were actually produced. But the B, which was identical except for minor improvements, went into full production. Increased range was always a consideration, and in-flight refueling, which had been perfected in the late 40s by Boeing's flying boom method, had solved many problems. However, all of the tankers in the early B-52 project were powered by piston engines, with a maximum speed little more than the stalling speed of the jet bombers. Here the Y model negotiates the delicate task. Jet tanker refueling at higher speeds was obviously preferable and safer. It was only with the arrival of the KC-135 Stratotanker that aerial refueling for jets became really viable. One other means of increasing the range was the adoption of extra-large outboard wing tanks, like this example, which can hold no less than 3,000 gallons, but which can be jettisoned in a combat situation when the fuel was consumed. By March 1954, B-52s were rolling off Boeing's production line in Seattle. They would then go into an induction program, where crew and aircraft would be blended into one fighting machine. Inside this sleek shape, crews of 6 men would learn the ways of the 52. After the B-36, they would certainly find Boeing's bomber much more compact, with every inch available dedicated to fuel, payload or electronics. Whilst the Peacemaker had no less than 6 gun positions, the 52 only had 1, relying more on its performance and the new science of jamming the enemy's radar. The Strategic Air Command had to have the world's best bomber. SAC was to make the same heavy demands of its crew that it did of its new aircraft. These men would be trained to an elite corps of professionals, making a team equal to the sophistication of the new bomber they flew. Because for over 10 years, the Stratofortress was to have one primary responsibility, that of delivering the thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. But if the bomb was to be carried as a deterrent, then it had to be tested to prove its potential. And throughout the 50s, hydrogen bombs were detonated in remote Pacific regions. The last tests, Operation Dominic, like many before, would use a B-52 to make the all-important drop. To these men, loading the most destructive device ever conceived by the human mind, it's a matter of precision and routine, a specialist hauling job for the Stratofortress. Although this cargo has a 100 megaton yield, 100 times greater than the bombs dropped on Japan. Unlike the weapons of the Second World War, the device carried in this bomb bay will be slowed in its drop from the B-52 by a parachute, allowing the bomber more time to vacate the area, and with very good reason. With the threat of a Russian atomic attack against the United States, America had produced an elaborate array of early detection facilities, based mainly in the frozen north, from where it was perceived the most logical attack would come. Radar watchers would constantly view through scanners, looking for a feared blip that might signal the beginning of the end. SAC's control rooms would have at their disposal fleets of B-52s on operational standby in a constant state of alert, ready to act as the ultimate deterrent if needed. When the red phone rang, the procedure was automatic. Up to 100 Stratofortresses could be dispatched in a few short minutes. The routine was finely tuned by regular exercise. The concept of an instant retaliatory strike by SAC was seen as the nation's best defense during the Cold War years. The business of nuclear deterrence was too awesome to be taken lightly, and all nuclear-armed B-52 pilots would be at least the rank of major, as the responsibility for what was held in the bomb bays in these aircraft could affect the ultimate fate of mankind. By the early 60s, even the high-flying B-52 and its Russian counterparts had fallen prey to other technology. Ground-to-air missiles had been perfected by both sides, to the stage where nuclear bombardment in the traditional sense would never be achieved. Both sides had the bomb, yet neither could deliver it by aircraft. The emphasis had shifted to another form of delivery, that of the intercontinental ballistic missile. Experiments had produced the Polaris and Minuteman, among other forms of rocketry, which meant that manned flights over enemy airspace were no longer necessary. SAC's Stratofortresses were still to play a major role in the dangerous game of nuclear brinkmanship. The trouble with ICBMs was that after launch they could not be recalled, and the time-honoured tactic of saber rattling was denied the military's political masters. The B-52, used in conjunction with the Hound Dog standoff bombs, provided a flexible alternative. B-52s could proceed towards the very edge of enemy airspace, signalling the nation's intention to attack, but still providing time for last-minute negotiations. Another innovation was the quail decoy, which mimicked the radio signal of the B-52 to confuse enemy radar. Further development after the Hound Dog produced the Shram missile. Small and able to be carried in greater numbers, the Shram could be guided from within the B-52 to targets up to 100 miles away with devastating accuracy. The B-52 was also involved with another type of missile drop, the manned missiles. The most famous of these were the X-15 rocket planes. Perhaps less known, but equally as successful, were the lifting body experiments, when strange-looking aircraft were dropped from great heights by a converted B-52. The program was designed to find the most suitable shape for a vehicle to make a controlled re-entry from space. On this test, the plane overturned on landing, and the pilot, who was injured, was taken to a waiting helicopter. A less sophisticated, but still more dramatic payload was borne by SAC's B-52s when they were employed for the first time in 1965 over Vietnam. The wing mounts would now carry 24 500-pound iron bombs, and the internal capacity brought the total payload of each plane up to 108. It is thought that during the course of the Stratofortress's involvement in Southeast Asia, they dropped in excess of 3 million tons of bombs. Although the program was the source of controversy at the time, there was absolutely no doubt about the effectiveness of the B-52s when used as a conventional bomber. It is only because SAC had the Stratofortress that it was able to complete its operation Linebacker 2, which ultimately forced the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table. But during other operations, more sophisticated bombs were sometimes dropped, and some could be detonated later by personnel in other aircraft using infrared viewing equipment to coincide an explosion with enemy activity. The standard 500 or 750-pound iron bomb, like these, was the staple diet for most B-52 raids. To facilitate quick loading and turnaround, the internal bomb load was contained in pre-arranged racks so that they could be installed in the shortest possible time. Crews initially based at Guam would arrive in preparation for the long 8-hour flight to their distant target. The crew in the front office and the lonely rear gunner would assume their positions as each aircraft prepared. Ahead would fly the KC-135 tankers, which would refuel the bomb-laden B-52s in flight, thus enabling the bombers to take off with a reduced fuel load, which would save wear on the engines. Target bound and in thin air over the Pacific, the tankers would top up the B-52s. They would also be available for the bombers' return flight. During the course of Vietnam, nose art on individual aircraft was sometimes seen. But although the art was sometimes tamer than its Second World War counterpart, the mission was no less hazardous. Not only did the 52 crews have fast and agile enemy MiGs to contend with, but also deadly surface-to-air missiles. After a raid, ground crew would hurriedly repair the bullet-pocked airframes of returned 52s, making them ready for the next mission. The thoughts of aircrew examining the nearness of these hits can only be imagined. Despite the low fuel takeoff policy, the heavy weight of the bomb load put tremendous stress on the engines, which regularly needed maintenance and often replacement. MiGs were kept at bay and sometimes actually shot down by the rear gunner, who, in his lonely outpost, employed a radar-aimed, remotely controlled array of 4 cannons with devastating hitting power. The tail gunner's position and the distinctive long rudder employed on models A through to F were deleted with the arrival of the later G and H models. Here, the shorter tail of a late model 52 is seen being jacked up from its horizontal storage position. The H model also employed turbofan engines which gave greater economy and range. The H was to be the last and most advanced B-52 subtype to go into production. Here, the first of the H models takes its maiden flight. Its rear armament has been modified with a 6-barrel Gatling gun, but the gunner is now in the front area with the rest of the crew. The H was the ultimate 52, and examples of it will doubtless still be flying in various roles well into the 90s, demonstrating the phenomenal durability of the original design, first flown in 1952. The Stratofortress's durability was also displayed on another B-52H used for research work, experimenting with the effect of gust turbulence on the large frame. Flying very low, deliberately looking for turbulence, the plane was suddenly picked up by a tremendous gust, and the huge aircraft was thrown up and sideways at the same time. A dreadful shudder went through the entire airframe, culminating in a loud crack, and the entire crew knew that something had gone dreadfully wrong. What had happened was that virtually all of the fin and rudder had been snapped off, in conditions that would have brought almost any other plane out of the sky. Astonishingly, the pilot regained control, and the crew elected to stay with the aircraft, which landed without one of its most fundamental flight control elements. All service G&H models now have EVS, Electronic Visual System. This enables the pilot and other crew members to see what is ahead of the aircraft, even in darkness and fog, via infrared television cameras and a monitor. This improvement was most timely, as the role of the B-52 had changed to that of a low-level tactical bomber, and it may now be required to fly through atomic cloud with the plane's interior shielded by radiation-proof curtains, and the EVS would provide the only visual input to the aircraft crew. Red phones and flashing lights are still the currency of SAC, and when the bell goes in exercise or in war, SAC's awesome deterrent force must swing into action. Now, the first thing a general in charge of operations will do is vacate his ground base for the safer mobility of an aerial command post. At the same time, the alert is given, and crews rush to their aircraft, which are always on standby for instant action. The General is airborne, and the 52s are close behind, because it is only in the safety of the air that SAC's deterrent force can survive an attack, and at the same time be on their way to deliver its response. the high-speed takeoff is a prerequisite to survival. In this exercise, the prospect of a nuclear flash is provided for. The radiation-resistant curtains are put into place. Now the crew are totally dependent upon the EVS system and other electronic aids, for they dare not look out of the cockpit. Flying low to the ground, each pilot waits his instructions. This time, the 52s are called back, but all concerned know that they have the capacity to go on if required. The exercise is over, and the general is content. SAC's 30-year-old bomber still performs well, but clearly time is running out. Almost as soon as the very first B-52s were rolling off the assembly line, SAC was looking to other designs for a replacement. Firstly, there was the ill-fated XB-70, whose design was overtaken by ground-to-air missile technology. More recently, there was the B-1 project with swing-wing technology developed by Rockwell Aviation, providing a combination of high speed and altitude with the wings swept, and more economical low-level flying with the wings forward. However, the cost of deploying large numbers of B-1s was not acceptable to the Carter administration, and this project was shelved throughout the 70s, only to be revived again in the early 80s. Not in the high-speed role, but dedicated to low-level bombing. Over 100 of these later models, now known as the B-1B, are being deployed by SAC. However, if the B-1B equals the overall performance and value for money that its predecessor, the B-52, so clearly achieved, then it will represent an extremely good investment for the Air Force. After 3 decades of service, through a period of unprecedented technological advances, the B-52 is still a weapon of awesome power and effectiveness. It will be a very hard act to follow.